8 months after the release of the Oculus Rift, the Oculus Touch is here, in theory, bringing Oculus up to speed with what the HTC Vive has had to offer for a while. But is it worth it? Let's find out. So if you need a refresher on the premium VR market, in March of 2016 we got the Oculus Rift, and for $600 you got the headset, you got a sensor to track the position of the headset, you got a wireless controller, and you got a little remote thing, which is useful for navigating menus, I guess, if you don't want to use an Xbox controller. And in April of 2016, the HTC Vive was released, and for $800 you got a more complete experience. You got the headset, you got 2 motion-tracked controllers, and you got 2 lighthouses, which are kind of the equivalent of the Oculus sensor. So right out of the gate, it's pretty clear the Vive has a pretty obvious advantage here. I mean, playing games with an Xbox controller on the Oculus is alright, like Lucky's Tale and stuff like that, it's pretty good. But walking around a virtual room-scale environment and having your hands represented in-game, being able to pick up virtual objects is a totally different experience altogether. And the Vive has had it for months, and the Oculus hasn't. But that feature disparity is now coming to an end, because for an additional $200, bringing it to the same $800 price point as the HTC Vive, you can get the Oculus Rift Touch controllers. In the box, we have the touch controllers themselves, and we have an additional Oculus sensor, bringing us up to 2. Oculus recommends you set up the 2 sensors in a front-facing setup. But if you want that room scale functionality that Vive owners have had for, 8 months, Oculus recommends you buy a 3rd sensor for an additional $80. So we're already paying more than what HTC Vive owners paid for 8 months ago to get the same or similar experience. Kinda sucks. Except you don't actually need the 3rd sensor. There's an experimental setup that Oculus has instructions for where you set the 2 sensors facing each other on a 45-degree angle, so they're like diagonal in your play space. And in my experience, I've gotten some pretty decent 360-degree tracking like that. There's definitely a few tracking hiccups here and there, especially when you compare it to the rock-solid tracking of the HTC Vive when properly set up, but it works. It works good enough to play Steam VR games like The Lab or Accounting, and you can actually get a pretty good room scale setup going with just the 2 included sensors. But to get the same high fidelity tracking experience that Vive owners have had for 8 months, you do have to spend more money. Not to mention, Oculus setup is going to run you at least 3 USB ports, possibly 4 if you want to add a 3rd sensor. Just 1 for the headset, 1 for each sensor. Pretty crazy compared to the one that the HTC Vive uses. It's just because of the different technology, the lighthouse sensors don't need to be connected to your computer directly. The Rift sensors, on the other hand, do, and it's kind of a pain in the ass because you don't know, you need extension cables for the USB cords and they don't always work properly, and your PCI USB 3 card might not be compatible with the Rift. Mine isn't, so I have to use the built-in ones on the motherboard, and it's a lot of ports to shuffle around. But the controllers themselves are phenomenal. It is quite a different experience seeing your hands represented in the game as hands instead of controllers. And that's why they're called touch controllers. A lot of the surfaces on here are capacitive touch surfaces, so the controllers are aware if you lift your fingers up like that or like this, so the hands that you see in game move like your actual hands, sort of, and that really helps immersion. Like, going back and playing an HTC Vive game now where your hands are just represented by some version of the HTC Vive controllers, I don't know, it's not the same. It feels antiquated a little bit. I would rather see a representation of my hands, and you totally forget you're holding controllers when you're playing Oculus Touch controlled games. So if you're thinking of doing a best of both worlds setup where you use the great Oculus Touch controllers and the HTC Vive headset and tracking method, not gonna happen. Just the technologies are incompatible. They both use different proprietary wireless technologies that aren't disclosed to sync with the headset. The controllers actually sync with the headset. Not to mention the lighthouses and the sensors use completely different methods to track the location of the controllers and the headset, so it might happen at some point in the future if modders get on it, but you're going to have both Oculus sensors and lighthouses set up in order to do something like that, and that's gonna run you a lot of money. Also included in the box is a Rock Band VR adapter that lets you attach a touch controller to a Rock Band guitar. but Rock Band VR isn't even out yet, so that's a little interesting, but thanks, Oculus, I guess. The launch lineup is pretty great for the Oculus Touch. There's no shortage of things to play on the Oculus Store itself. There's a few freebies like Dead and Buried, which is great, and a lot of the physics demos like the Toy Box and the Oculus Medium, really fun to play around with. Not to mention, you have the whole backlog of HTC Vive Steam VR games, the vast majority of which will work fine with Oculus Touch, Oculus Rift setup, so there's lots of stuff to play. For the few premium games I did buy, like Fruit Ninja and Job Simulator, I tend to buy things on the Steam store instead of in the Oculus Store. I mean, it's still a mix of both, but I know it's very likely that someday down the line I'm going to get another VR headset, and it probably isn't going to be an Oculus one, and I'm pretty sure Oculus isn't going to open up their store system anytime soon and let it be used with other headsets, so I know buying them on Steam will keep my options open. So is the Oculus Touch worth it? If you already bought the Rift 8 months ago, it's sitting there collecting dust, then God, yes, it's worth it. It's a completely different experience having motion-tracked controllers. It is not the same thing at all. Really, they should have never been separate products, but, you know, I guess the Oculus Rift just had to make it to market, and these things weren't ready in time. But if you don't have either headset yet, it's a bit of a tougher call. The Oculus advantage is being the better controllers, in my opinion, and the ability to play games on the Oculus Store and the Steam VR Store, with the HTC's advantage being that it all comes in one package for one price, and you know it's going to work really well without having to fiddle with 3 or 4 sensors. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Is It Worth It? Be sure to subscribe for more, and we'll see you next time.